Bruchim Abayim, here in Yerushalayim, Yer HaKodesh, and around the world. Welcome to Rabbi Ginsburgh's monthly English Shiur. The Rav will be here in, here he is right this second as I speak. Good timing. For those who get the announcements about the shiur, so the Rav has already announced what he will be speaking on. Here already, it's the 21st of Tevet. We're just starting the 21st of Tevet. But for most people watching, it's still the 20th of Tevet, and it is the yurtzeit of the RAMBAM. And the Rav already announced that is what he's going to be speaking about. I just want to mention that I was given a 2-volume set in English, the translation from Hebrew of the dynasty of the Abu Chatzera family. And I remember last month the Rav already saying that the 20th of Tevet is the Rambam's yurtzeit, and it turns out that it's a long chain in the Abu Chatzera family. The Baba Sali is, from a long line of a great Chachamim, and one of them was called the Abir Yaakov, and his yurtzeit is also on the 20th of Tevet. And with the
also in Mitzrayim, he was also in Egypt, the same place as him.
Right, and he's buried in Egypt. But with the Rav's permission, just very, very quickly, there's an amazing story about the Baba Sali that he came to Eretz Yisrael a few times before he moved here. But when he moved here, he moved to Yavna. His daughter and son-in-law were in Yavna. And one time, one of the teachers from the yeshiva came, and they were having a whole discussion. And this teacher was giving the Baba Sali an analysis of the difference between the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov. And in short, he was basically saying the Vilna Gaon knew how to learn, and the Baal Shem didn't know how to learn so much. The Baba Sali was incensed. He said, how can you talk about the Baal Shem Tov like this? How can this be? And he said to him, tomorrow your yeshiva is closing down. And the man was like freaked out. He left. He went to his son-in-law and said, I cannot stay in a place where they talk about the Baal Shem Tov like this. He packed his bags and he left Yavna. And he ended up in the Tivot. And so it turns out...
The yeshiva closed the next day.
Yes, and what happened is the next day, a letter arrived from the Misrad HaDatot saying, we've done checks and we can no longer support the yeshiva. And so it closed. Anyways, it turns out that the Baba Sali and his son, Rabbeinu Meir, were experts in Hasidus, which is amazing because usually we think of Moroccan Chachamim as not being exposed to Hasidut, but it's not true. They love the Baal Shem Tov and all of Hasidut. So it's the Abir Yaakov's yurtzeit tonight. Okay, just a few announcements and we'll begin the shiur. For those who like to mark it down, the next shiur, the first Sunday of February, is February 4th, the 19th of Shvat. I assume the same place here. And we have an important announcement which I'll make now and I'll make later also, is a lecture tour is being organized for Rabbi Ginsburgh to the United States that will take place after Shavuot, approximately from June 21st or 2nd, something like that, for 2 or 3 weeks. And so we are starting early, but it's not early enough that we're turning to people who are watching this, who are connected to various Beit Knessets or Kehilot, that if you're interested in Rabbi Ginsburgh coming to your community, please be in touch with us through the WhatsApp or through the list for this shiur, that we're looking for places that will host the Rav. And it goes without saying that a trip like this and going from city to city takes a substantial financial reality to this. So we need more than just kind of like ideas of where the Rav can teach. We're looking for people who are interested in not only organizing it, but organizing the support that would be needed to bring Rabbi Ginsburgh to your community. So this announcement will be repeated many times over the next few months, but the Rav has not done a lecture tour in America in a number of years, so this is a golden opportunity to bring Rabbi Ginsburgh to your community.
So good evening and good morning and afternoon to everyone around the world. As we just heard, today is the Yortzeit of the Rambam, who perhaps is the greatest well-known scholar, both in the realm of halakha, Jewish law. He is the author of the Code. His most famous halakhic work is the Code of Law, 14 books that include all of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, commandments of the Torah, with their explanation, all of the details of the laws as handed down from Sinai in the oral Torah. And as well, he is the author of the Guide to the Perplexed. These two great works are the Code and the Guide, which is philosophic work that expounds all of Jewish thought in accordance with his understanding, which we all probably know was based largely on Aristotle. That we'll discuss this a little bit this evening, today. Many great authorities, even in his own time, when he was still alive and after he passed away, were not so happy with his guide, because of this very fact that we just now said, that he based his philosophic thought on Aristotle. But nonetheless, he has over the generations, we'll say, been proven by Jewish tradition to be to still remain the accepted authority in also in philosophic thought. He does not always agree with Aristotle, as we'll also explain today. What we're going to do this evening is go through different facets of his thought and his shita, his system, And in order to organize it in a pedagogic way, as we always do, we'll try to go through the different areas of thought in accordance with the Sfirot, with 10 Sfirot, beginning with the Keter, the crown, which is the suprarational level of the soul, and concluding with Malchut, kingdom. So let's immediately begin in this way. In the soul, the highest level of the soul is Maimonides' faith. The primary belief of the RAMBAM is that God has no corporal reality to himself whatsoever. And that to imagine corporality vis-a-vis God is borders on heresy. This does not just go for actual physical limbs like the finger of God, the hand of God, the voice of God, but it also applies to attributes, to any spiritual attributes, even good attributes, like God is kind. We're allowed to say that God is kind, but actually to think that God is kind in the same way that a man, that a human being is to be kind, it also borders on anthropomorphism. When the Rambam speaks of faith, he differentiates between absolute or true faith, he calls it, versus necessary faith. What is the difference between true faith and necessary faith? The true faith is, as we just now said, that God has no attributes as we understand them whatsoever, just as he has no limbs or no corporality whatsoever. Necessary faith, he brings an example of that for all of us common folk, that we're all common folk, it's important to believe that if I misbehave, so God gets angry at me. The result of that anger can be in many different ways. But I have to feel in a certain sense and believe that my actions affect God either to be happy with me or to be not happy with me. To get angry. And the example that he brings is actually is anger, the attribute of anger. This is most appropriate to this month, that we're now in the month of Tevet, because according to Sefer Yetzirah, every month has a sense to it, and the sense of this month is actually called the sense of anger. So the fact that the Rambam makes a special point about talking about anger, is most appropriate now to his Yortzeit, which is the day that all of his life rises up and returns to its source in order to bring down blessing to all those that are connected to him. We all probably know that the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was very, very adamant about studying the Rambam and feel connection to the Rambam. So this is the day to bring down blessing from his soul. And once more, we're in a month whose sense, spiritual sense, is referred to as the sense of anger. So he talks about anger. He says that God doesn't get angry. You can't say that God is. True faith is to know that anger and God do not go together. Just like no attribute whatsoever can you link to God himself. But there is what he calls necessary faith to feel that if I do something wrong, so I anger God. I make him angry with me. Of course, there's something which is a further extreme. Actually, there are three different categories of faith. There's true faith, and there's necessary faith, and there's false faith, which is false faith is to say that that a person believes, if we still use this attribute of anger, believes in an angry God. Some people think that in different religions, even something people think wrongly about Judaism, about the Bible, that it pictures, it describes, depicts an angry God. So to think of God as an angry God, chas v'shalom, God forbid, to picture God as an angry God. And a person that believes in that is false belief is like saying superstition. It's a superstition altogether. It's called emunah, but it's also, the term in Hebrew is emunah tefillah, false faith. So actually there are three different categories of faith. There's true faith. Now we use the example of anger. The true faith is that there's no anger. God is never angry. There's no such thing as anger in relation to God. The necessary faith is to feel that I anger God. And the false faith is to picture God as an angry old man or young man. That's superstition altogether, and that's false. So one most interesting thing that we see from this simple analysis is that the RAMBAM actually places an intermediate zone between truth and falsehood. In classical logic, even in Aristotle, a statement is either true or false. There's nothing in between. Actually, we had a series of talks, of classes about this a few weeks ago in Hebrew, about logic. And classical logic, something is either true or false. There's nothing in between. If there's something in between true and false, that's already quantum logic. It's not classical logic. So we already have here some hint, allusion, that the RAMBAM is way before his time, that the concept of necessary belief is not, it's neither true or false. It's something in between. So this is, we chose this to be the first point that we're making this evening because it pertains to faith. Faith is the highest level of the soul. But actually it pertains to my faith in God, not to God's faith. How I believe in God. That a true mind, according to the Ramas, will go on to explain the whole purpose of man on earth is to perfect his intellectual conception of the divine. And to the extent that a person has succeeded in perfecting his contemplation of the divine of God, so once more, God and anger do not go together, just as God and any attribute do not go together. But for all of us, as we said before, that very same person at a simpler level of consciousness in daily life should feel that if I do something wrong, I anger God. On the other hand, to think of God as an angry figure, that's totally false. It's the opposite of the truth. Now we'll say something also at the level of Keter, of the crown, but from God's perspective on us, not from our perspective on Him. And that will be regarding will, the power of will. For us, the highest power of the soul is faith. In general, the crown, the level of crown in Kabbalah is identified with will, the power of will, which is above the mind. The question is, how can God possess will in the first place? Because will is also a predicate. God wills, God wants something. How can God, according to the RAMBAM, according to the philosophy of the RAMBAM, possess will? And especially, how can He will something anew? Because not only is it a question about willing something, it's also a question about change in what we'll call the Godhead. That no change can exist. We even have a verse, an expressive verse that says, Ani Hashem lo shaniti, I am God, I do not change. How can He will something new? That appears to be a change in God. This relates to the creation of the world, ex nihilo. At the very beginning of the Eitz Chaim, the classic text of Kabbalah of the Arizal, so he asks a very simple sounding question. If the world is a good thing and God desires to create the world, why didn't He create it long ago? Way before He actually created it. Trillions of years before. Why did He wait so long? As the Arizal asked the question. So of course it seems like a very obvious answer to the question, because we're taught that that time itself is a created reality. Before the creation of the world there was no time in the first place. So how can you ask a question, why didn't He create it before? But here the question is, it's actually the same question, just in a different garb. That what arousal is at a certain point, whether we'll call it time or not time, but at some level there's an arousal of will to create that appears to imply a change in God. As though before, whatever that word before and after means, before He did not will and now He does will. So something changed. So the Rambam deals with this also at length in the guide. And the explanation is, in simple terms, that if there is and was always an intention to will at a certain point, then when that point comes about and the will takes effect, that is not considered a change in God. Meaning that, once more in the simplest words, also still using the thought, the concept of the context of time, if God had planned primordially, from ever and ever and ever ago, at a certain moment, to actively will the creation of the world. So when that moment came and He willed, and thereby He created the world in that very split second, so that is no change in Him. Since the intention was there from ever and ever ago. Meaning that actually He identifies here two levels of will. the actual will and the intention to will. Would there not be an intention to will, then the will would involve or imply a change. But if there was always an intention to will, then the will does not imply a change. That's the simple statement. Meaning that everything that God wills, as we say that we pray, a person is sick, and according to nature, he's fatally, mortally ill. But we pray, and God performs a miracle, and He answers the prayer, and the person gets well. And we obviously believe in this, and the RAMBAM certainly believes in this. As one of the principles of faith is that we should only pray to God. Do not worship and do not pray anything else except God, the one God. So what happens? So before he did not have an explicit active will. In a moment we're going to talk about a concept which is called active intelligence versus potential or passive intelligence. But now we're talking the same idea, or a similar idea at the level of will. Actively there was not will to heal this individual. But through the means of prayer, the will came about. But according to the RAMBAM, in order that does not imply a change in God, we must believe that there was an intention all the time, from the beginning of time, that when this particular person is sick and this particular person prays for him to recover, that God is going to create, as it were, a new will and miraculously heal this individual. And since that intention was there all the time, Ani Hashem lo shaniti, there is no change in God. Meaning that there is a hidden, concealed ratzon in the terminology of Chassidut that is called ratzon atzmi, an essential will in God, which we can't fathom at all, just we can't fathom God at all. And that in itself has, so to speak, written within it all of the apparent changes of will that will be throughout the history of creation, from beginning to end, based, at least partially, on the service of man in our prayers and our worship of God. Right, so now we learned about the difference between primordial intention and active will. Now let's turn to another concept, a related concept that we just now mentioned, that has to do with wisdom. We know that some of the basic critics of the RAMBAM, even in our tradition, like the Maharal Prague, and afterwards in Chassidut, criticized the RAMBAM for apparently depicting God as pure, essential intellect. So in Tanya also, he explains that God is one with his mind, but that God is not to be identified with intellect. And definitely when the Alter Rebbe learned the guide of the Rambam, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, with his son, the fourth Rebbe learned. They learned the guide in accordance with a deep understanding of Chassidut. And one of the most important things is that God is not to be defined as perfect intellect, as perfect mind. Something else, something which totally transcends mind. Nonetheless, the concept of mind and intellect is very, very important and central to the thought and the system of the RAMBAM, Maimonides. And one of the important concepts, and here also he differs with Aristotle, is the concept that we mentioned before, which is called Seichel HaPoel, active intelligence. According to Aristotle, active intelligence and God, if there is a God or a creator, are identified as the same. But according to the Rambam, they're definitely not the same. Because God is not to be defined as the Seichel HaPoel, the active intelligence, but the first thing which exists, or we'll call it also the intermediate, which connects the soul of man and the intellect of man to God, is this concept which is called the active intelligence. Now, active intelligence versus passive intelligence. What does passive intelligence mean? It means the ability to know. I say that a child is born with a high IQ. So that high IQ that he possesses, from the moment that he's born, that's his passive intelligence. But when he learns and he studies and he knows, that's the passive intelligence has become active. Has been actualized. It's become actual intelligence. Now, intelligence in God is always actual. So that's called Seichel HaPoel. It's a very beautiful, the first gematria we'll make this evening. That term, Seichel HaPoel, which the Rambam uses and loves, we'll calculate the value of that phrase, Seichel HaPoel. So we'll see that it equals 541, which is the same value as Israel. There's something about this most important concept in the teaching of the Rambam, which now we're placing at the level of wisdom, which is Seichel HaPoel, and that is the origin of the soul, according to this, as alluded to by this gematria that we just now mentioned. This is the origin of the soul of Israel. Even though it's most important to know that on the simple level, in the guide, this is one of the differences between the guide and the code. The Rambam has its two pillars, both of expertise, that he's the greatest expert in both fields, and two pillars of we'll even call it personality, as we'll go on to explain. To the extent that later philosophers and later sages, both religious and secular, sometimes get the feeling that we have two Rambams. They appear to be so different from one another. The Rambam of the code and the Rambam of the guide. So this may be the most important thing that we'll have to try to understand a little bit today. But we're now explaining that that in the guide and in most of the teachings of the Rambam, the philosophic teachings, he makes it very clear that every single human being, whether Jew or non-Jew, in accordance with his deeds and his devotion to knowing God, the one and only God, so can he merit even to prophecy, Actually, the Rambam is not the first one to say this. There's an explicit saying in Tana Develia, on one of the Midrashim of Chazal, that all depends upon deed and sincerity of heart in searching for God, and there's no distinction which is made between Jew and non-Jew in this respect. So once more, that's the feeling that you get in learning the guide, that it's that the word secular is a problematic word, obviously. But if we just understand secular to mean that there's no difference between Jew and non-Jew, so it's definitely has that tone to it. And that's why the Rambam allows himself to rely so much in his philosophy on a non-Jew. On a non-Jew that represents and symbolizes Greek culture. Exactly what we're just now coming out of the holiday of Hanukkah in this very month of Tevet, which is the month of the Yortzeit of the Rambam. The holiday that commemorates our victory over Hellenistic culture. And the Rambam himself allows himself, and obviously he's properly relying upon the verse, Yavta Elokim liyafet v'yishkon ba'alei Shem, that God has given beauty in different forms to Yafet, who is one of the sons of Noah, from whom Greece derives, and it will dwell in the tents of Shem. And the tents of Shem means in Jewish culture. It will become incorporated within Jewish culture. So obviously that's what the Rambam is doing. But then we have to understand even deeper what is the battle, the ongoing, in our day also, the ongoing battle between Hellenism and Judaism. So this question maybe we'll not right now answer. Just the question is a question, and the Rambam is here to relying and praising. He praises Aristotle the highest possible praise. At the same time, he disagrees with him on many, many, many different matters. So once more, now we'll go back to our Seichel HaPoel, the active intelligence. If God wants to convey prophecy to a human being who has made his ultimate effort to know God and to purify himself, then the prophecy flows from God through the active intelligence, the Seichel HaPoel, to the intelligence of that individual. So actually, according to the Rambam, in the simplest diagram, there are actually 4 levels. There's God, which some feel that the Rambam himself said that God is the ultimate intelligence, more than the active intelligence. The ultimate, absolute intelligence. From that, and we said before that we do not want to identify God as intelligence. Nonetheless, some feel that the Rambam does understand or believe in God as the absolute intelligence, but just like any predicate, we cannot use intelligence as I know intelligence, understand intelligence to be as a predicate to God or as a descriptive of God. But God is wise. What that means, we'll go on try to understand a little bit more. Then comes the Seichel HaPoel, which is the intermediate between God and the intelligence of man. Then comes the spiritual, non-corporal intelligence of the soul, which is even above what is called the nefesh. According to the Rambam, Seichel, pure intelligence of man, is above what's called the nefesh, the soul of man. And then comes the seichel of man as it is embodied in a body. And since it's in a body, my mind is in my body, so my body involves imagery of corporal things, corporal reality. That is called koach hamedameh, the power of imagination. But the prophet, the true prophet, also employs his power of imagination, purifies to a certain extent his power of imagination, and that is all the symbolism of prophecy. So actually, how does prophecy work, according to the RAMBAM? It works from God to the Seichel HaPoel, to the pure, non-corporal intelligence of the soul, to the corporal koach hamedameh, power of imagination in the soul as the soul is embodied in a body. So actually these four levels themselves can be seen to be identified or correspond to the four letters of Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. The power of, beginning from below, the power of imagination, or the intelligence within a body, and images, corporal images, reflecting spiritual insight. That is the lowest level. That's the level of Malchut, the final Hay of Hashem's name. The Seichel of man itself, the non-corporal intelligence of man, that can be seen as the Vav, that these two levels are intelligence of man. The Vav and the Hay of Hashem's name are called V'haniglot lano levanenu, the two levels that pertain to us. But then above that is an intermediate level between God and us, which is called the Seichel HaPoel, which according to the Gematria that we mentioned before, can be seen, can be understood, at least by us, can be understood to be the root of Knesset Yisrael, the collective soul of Israel. And above that is God Himself. That's the flowchart of prophecy. But this whole concept of Seichel HaPoel will place that at the level of Chokhmah in the overall picture of the philosophy of the Rambam, of Maimonides. Now we'll move on to the next level, which is the level of Binah, of understanding. And we'll base this, every level here is a little meditation in and of itself. This meditation is according to the very common, popular adage that Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ki Moshe. This adage actually is more or less from the time of the Rambam himself. He was so loved and appreciated and revered in his own generation and the generations that immediately followed him, that the people said, and this became a ma'amar ha'am of the people that said, from Moses to Moses, none arised as Moses. There was no one like Moses. Meaning, from Moshe Rabbeinu, the giver of the Torah to Am Yisrael, that again, most appropriately, this is exactly what we're reading about in the Torah, about Moshe Rabbeinu being born and coming to redeem us and then give us the Torah and then build the tabernacle. Just at this time of the Yortzeit of the Rambam. That from Moses to Moses, no one stood up as Moses. We know that when Hashem first spoke to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, which we read this just yesterday in Shabbos. So he calls him by name twice. He repeats his name twice, Moshe, Moshe. And Moshe answers, Hineni, here I am, ready to hear and accept. even though afterwards he actually argued for a whole week, for 7 days, not to accept the mission that God intended for him. But he answered immediately with perfect humility, as we know that he was Anav Modi, was the most humble of all men, Hineni, just like Abraham, when he was addressed, also answered Hineni. Other great Hasidim answered Hineni, this word Hineni. Here I am, I'm ready. But God spoke to him and said, Moshe, Moshe, we already said, mentioned this word Hineni. We'll also see a very beautiful gematria, that Hineni equals 115. Moshe is 345. What is the 3 times? Meaning that the average value of the 3 letters of Moshe equals Hineni. So God calls him Moshe, Moshe, and he answers Hineni. So again, so that there are other great figures in the Tanakh that answer God, Hineni, here I am. The first of which is Abraham. Well, now I'll mention that according to the RAMBAM, the 2 greatest figures in the Bible that we are to emulate are Abraham and Moses. Those are the 2 figures that he loves the best. So the first to answer Hineni is Abraham, but nonetheless this word Hineni is the average value of the 3 letters of Moses. Another word that equals the exact value of 115, like Hineni, is Chazak. For which reason, after we complete a Chumash, like last week when we completed the first Chumash, the first of the 5 books of Moses, we call them the 5 books of Moses, so we all proclaim together Chazak, Chazak, Benit Chazak, or according to some versions, just 3 times repeat Chazak, 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 which equals Hineni, 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 which equals Moshe. It's as though Moshe himself, in our coming out of our mouths, is signing his signature on that book of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of Moses. So once more, God calls Moses by repeating his name twice. There are other figures whose name is also repeated twice, Abraham, Jacob, and Samuel, Shmuel. That God calls them twice. Repeats the name, Abraham, Abraham, Yaakov, Yaakov, Shmuel, Shmuel. In each of those 3 cases in the Bible, there is a line called a psik ta'ama, a vertical line which separates, it's not in the Torah scroll, but in a Bible with cantillation marks. So there is a cantillation mark that differentiates between the 2 names. I mean, there's a difference between the first appearance of the name and the second appearance of the name. But only in the case of Moses, there is no difference, there's no line which separates the 2 names. So many, many explanations of what this means. But in our context, based upon this popular adage of Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kan Moshe, that from Moses to Moses no one stood up like Moses, so we can say that goes to say that from Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, the first Moshe, until our second Moshe, which is the RAMBAM, there's absolutely no differentiation between them whatsoever, no separation. They're virtually the same. They're both implied in the word nun, because nun is written nun, vav, nun, which can be nun, v'nesher, because nesher also begins with a nun. So it's a giant fish and a great eagle. That's the Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kan Moshe. If we want to make a little bit a deeper analysis of these 2 words, nun and nesher, so each has 3 letters to it, and if we perform a simple mathematical function which is called haka'a pratit, like In English it's taking a dot product, meaning that we multiply nun times nun. 50 times 50 is 2,500. Then vav times shin. The vav of nun times the shin of nesher, we get 1,800. Then the nun, the final nun of nun, times the resh of nesher, we get 10,000. Altogether, how much did we get? No. 2,500, 1,800, and 10,000. What? There we have it. 14300. 14300 is a very significant number. It's a multiple of Hashem's name of 26. Let's divide it by 26 and see what we get. We get 550 times 26, but 550 is Nesha. So by this process, there's no reason on earth, and also from ocean, from sea, there's no reason under sea and no reason on earth, over earth, that the result of this function gives us a multiple of one of the two words, which is Nesher Hava, the eagle of God, both together, meaning that the first Moses enters into the second Moses, and altogether becomes God's eagle. Right, so all of this, we're placing now this understanding that the two are two different levels of understanding. That the first Moses is the higher level of understanding, and the second Moses is the lower level of understanding. And about that is said that Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kan Moshe. And Moses in general merits true understanding. Right, now we'll go on to the next level, which is the level of knowledge. This is perhaps the most important thing about the philosophy of the Rambam. His philosophy, his theology is referred to as negative theology. Negative theology means that I can only know God through negation. There's no positive way of knowing God, as we said before in relation to anger, that the true faith is that anger and God cannot go together, because nothing can go together with God. No attribute whatsoever can be given to God. So if it says in the Torah that God is wise, what does that mean, according to the Rambam? It means that God is not wise. It is not correct to attribute to God anything other than wisdom, anything which is the opposite of wisdom. But, once more, now we have something very, very important, as we said before at Keter, that there's some quantum logic in the thought of the Rambam. Because according to simple logic of Aristotle himself, to be not wise is two minuses. In simple logic, two minuses equal a plus. So if the meaning of negation is not, the opposite is when I say that God is wise, I mean that God is not wise, but not wise is the same thing as saying that God is wise. So what do I accomplish? I accomplish nothing. But that's not what the Rambam has in mind. What does the Rambam mean when he said that God is not wise? It means that God is not wise, and at the same time, God's wisdom is not comparable to any possible image or understanding of wisdom that I, a human being, can possess. In saying so, the Rambam is actually just rephrasing a saying from Patach Eliyahu, the introduction to Tikkunei Zohar, which probably he did not see, even though some people think that maybe he did see some of the text from the Zohar. But this is a classic example that in the famous Patach Eliyahu, introduction to the beginning of the Tikkunei Zohar, that we read every week before Shabbos, it says there that Antu Hakim velo b'chokma yediyah. You are wise, but not with any understandable, comprehensible wisdom. So you're wise, but in no possible way that I understand what your wisdom means, what that means for you to be wise. So when the Rambam says that I cannot say that God is wise as I understand wise to be, and I can only express it through negation, he means that the negation of not is not the same that minus equals plus. But it's minus and something else, something in addition to minus, which is Antu Hakim velo b'chokma yediyah. This is called Yedi'at HaShlila. Knowing, trying to come closer, as we'll explain a little bit more, to come closer to God through knowing God through negation. And this is the service of man, the most essential service of man on earth, is to come close to God through negation of all physicality, of all corporality. And once more, to be able to negate, whereas if it would be the opposite, for instance, God is angry, we said before, God is an angry, that I can say, no, God is not an angry God. I don't need a double negation. But to say that God is a kind, a loving, kind God, I need a double negation. I can only, that if I want to say that in truth, I have to say that God is not kind. But his kindness means I'm allowed to say God is kind. But when I say God is kind, I have to understand that I mean that God is not kind, and that what I am saying that God is kind is a kindness that I cannot comprehend. I'm just allowed to say that God is kind because that's the way it feels to me. That's the way the energy reaches me. But to say that God is cruel, that I can say that God is not cruel, period. I don't need negation, an additional negation for that. Okay, so this is called Yedi'at HaShlila. According to Chassidut, there is also a possibility of the soul, as we said before, the Rambam does not distinguish between a Jewish soul and a non-Jewish soul. But we begin learning the Tanya, and the second chapter begins with the fact that a Jewish soul is something special, that it's a chedek elokam imam mamash. And because of that, there is a direct way for that spark of godliness in the Jewish soul to know, which means to contact, to identify God. To a little bit appreciate and understand this, there's a famous word, a famous saying of Rabbi Hillel of Paritz, one of the great Hasidim, that he says that all of one's life, one is searching after a lost melody that one heard at some primordial point in his soul's reincarnations of the origin of the soul and godliness. And he comes down to earth and he searches for this melody. And every melody that he hears, when he hears a new melody, he runs to listen to the melody. But after hearing the melody, he says, that's not it. And so he lives through his whole life, trying to remember that melody and hearing myriads of melodies, and each one saying at the end, no, that's not the melody. So this is very similar to, we can never know anything about God. But if we nonetheless use this story, there is something, the soul did once hear this melody. And at some point, the soul will once more hear this melody. That's called Yedi'at HaChiyuv, positive theology. So actually, one important way of making a symbol or an acronym for Yud Kei Vav Kei is that Hashem's name of 4 letters, just the two letters by themselves are the intellectual letters, and they form a divine name by itself. The second 2 letters by themselves, the second 2 letters do not form a divine name. But the ultimate is to put it all together. And for us, the phrase will be Yedi'at HaShlila v'Yedi'at HaChiyuv. There are many other examples that Yud Kei Vav Kei is a phrase which begins Yud and Hey, and then the second 2 letters read V and another phrase which begins the same way, a complementary phrase. So for our contemplation right now, we'll say that Yud Kei Vav Kei is the Rambam's way of knowing God, which is Yedi'at HaShlila, knowing God through negation, and the Hasidic way, the possibility of hearing this melody once more, because someplace in my soul it's there, the impression of divinity, of positive divinity of knowing God is there. I just have to hear it, to merit to hear it once more. Yud Kei Vav Kei Yedi'at HaShlila v'Yedi'at HaChiyuv. About Moses it says, one of the most important phrases about Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, is Lo Chen Avdi Moshe. No, yes, not so. Not so is my servant Moses, in all of my house he is faithful. This is what God says about Moses in the Torah. Lo chen avdi Moshe. So those 2 words, not so, is comparing him to other prophets. That other prophets prophesy and dream in what's called a translucent pain, but Moses sees God through, as it were, a translucent pain, a transparent pain. And so it says, Lo chen avdi Moshe, not so. But those 2 words, not so, are literally no, yes. So from this, we learn a very, very deep teaching that Moses knows God. First, no is negative theology, the Rambam's approach. But yes, there's also a positive theology, and that's Yud Kei Vav Kei altogether. The word lo is 30 and 1. 30 of the 3 higher sfirot, the Yud Kei. The 1 is the level of knowledge which unifies the Yud Kei and the Vav Kei. Then comes Ken. The word Cain is 70. It's written Cain, Kaf, Nun, 20 and 50. 70 of the 7 attributes of the heart of the Vav Kei of Hashem's name. Lo, the higher level, and Ken, the lower level, but they have to unite together. Lo chen avdi Moshe b'chol beiti ne'ema. Now we'll go on to Chesed. Chesed, the Rambam says that God is perfectly good. But as we said before, to be perfectly good means that He is not good, and His goodness is absolute. The way that He's good, I can say that He's good, and I should say that He's good. He's only good. But it's not. But truly, in regard to him, he's not good in any way that I can understand what good means. Just like it says, Antu Chakim v'lo b'chokma yediah. So actually the Balatanya says that also goes for all of the Sfirot, not just for wisdom and understanding, as it says in Patach Eliyahu. But that goes for all of the Sfirot. Antu Chasid v'lo b'chesed yediah, Antu Gibor v'lo b'gibura yediah, and so forth and so on. All of the attributes of God are the same thing vis-a-vis God. Where does evil come from? One of the most important philosophical queries. So the RAMBAM says that 99% of evil a person does to himself. If something bad, chas v'sholom, happens to someone, so the majority of the chance is that he is responsible himself for that bad happening to him. There is a small minority of chance, says the RAMBAM, that the bad is what other people do to him. And there's even a smaller minority of chance that the bad is from nature. Once more. It's a simple but most important teaching of the RAMBAM. What's important is the proportions that he gives. Because many people would say that most bad that happens in the world is just nature is responsible, is to blame for the evil in the world. Others will say that who's responsible for the evil? The government, or my friends, my so-called friends. They're the ones that did it. But then there is who's responsible for the evil? I'm responsible. If it's evil to me, I'm responsible for the evil. So this is one of the most important simple teachings of the RAMBAM. That the minority is nature, and there's another larger but also a very small minority, which is other people. And the overwhelming majority of evil is what a person does to himself. It means that there are three categories of evil. Those three categories of evil are where evil comes from. According to the Ram, correspond to the three lower worlds in Kabbalah. Bri'ah, Yetzirah, Asiyah, Afasitiv. The majority of evils explained in the Kabbalah is in this world of Asiyah, and that evil is what a person does to himself. Less than that is the evil that other people do to him, and that's from the world of Yetzirah. And less than that is what just nature, God created nature. But nature has laws to it, and sometimes what appears to be bad things come out of nature. Some catastrophe of nature. Very small proportion, but it happens. That's the world of creation, the world of Bria. But when it comes to good, there are 4 levels of good. What are the 4 levels of good? There are only 3 levels of bad. But there are 4 levels of good. Because all of these 3 levels can also be good. If I breathe, nature is doing me a favor. So there's infinitely more good that comes from nature than bad that comes from nature. There's also much more good that comes from other people. I have to recognize, I have to be grateful and thank other people for all the good that they bestow upon me. Much more than the evil. Even vis-a-vis myself, this is already questionable because there's so much bad that I do to myself. But I also sometimes am good to myself. So all the 3, just like there are 3 sources of evil, you have the same 3 sources of good. But there's another source of good, which there's no corresponding level to evil at all. And that's what God does directly, because no evil comes from God at all. What's more, evil, as it says, the verse says, no evil descends from heaven at all. But good definitely does. Sometimes it's enclosed within nature, and sometimes it's not enclosed within nature. But if it's not enclosed within nature, it's a miracle. But miracles also sometimes are enclosed in natural garb, and sometimes are revealed. Like we're now beginning to read about the 10 plagues and all the other miracles of the Exodus of Egypt. That's coming from the world of Atzilut. So once more, evil can come from one of the 3 lower worlds. It's called nature, other people, and myself. And good can come from all of the 4 worlds. From the world of Atzilut, which is good coming directly from God, or enclosed within nature, or through the means of other people, or afasitiv, sometimes from myself. In short, because now we're being told to make it brief, short and sweet. So try to make it as short and sweet as possible. We will not relinquish all the other sfirot. So we have here, we've reached Chesed, now we have to go to Gvura. Gvura, we'll just say very short, is the Yada Chazaka. The law of the Rambam, the code, is called the strong hand. It's divided into 14 books. Of all numbers, the Rambam liked the number 4 the best, and second best, he liked the number 14. Why? Because he was born on the 14th of Nisan. The very first book that he wrote is called the Treatise on Logic, Milot Higayon, which he divides on purpose into 14 chapters. Then his great code of Jewish law is the 14 books of the Yada Chazakah, the Mishneh Torah. So we see already, this is called Chazakah in Hebrew, when something repeats itself 3 times. It's called a Chazakah. So in the Rambam, there's a very simple Chazakah 14 that he likes, which is his birth date and his first book that he wrote, and his most important book of Jewish Halakha, which is the code, all based upon the number 14. And the 14 is called Yad HaChazak. There are 3 hands in Kabbalah. The great hand, which is the right hand, and the strong hand, which is the left hand, and the uplifted hand, which is actually the body itself, which is like a hand that rises up through the means of through the channel of the head. The strong hand, which is the hand of the Rambam, it all has to do with Exodus. All these hands appear in the context of the Exodus that we're reading about now in the Torah. And the strong hand is the left hand, which is the hand of law, and that's most appropriate to the code, to his code. So that concept of the strong hand of the Rambam, and also according to the Arizal, the soul of the Rambam itself comes from the left, from Gvura. So we'll place that in Gvura. The next Sfirah is Tiferet. Tiferet is beauty. One of the meanings of Tiferet, of beauty, is feeling close to God. As we said before, some of the critics of the Rambam criticize the fact that according to the Rambam, the one and only way to truly be close to God is through knowing God intellectually. Through dedicating one's life to meditation, to contemplation. That way you come close, that means close to God. Several hundred years after, about 200 years after the Rambam came a very great sage called Reb Chistai Krakas, and wrote a book called Or Hashem, which actually was a critique on the Rambam. And one of his most important points that we discussed at length about a year ago or so is that to be a good Jew and to be close to God is not a function, a sole function of mind. It's more a function of heart, of sincerity, of heart, of love, of being a good person. That's the way, that brings you close to God. And so obviously Hasidus would probably follow that latter opinion. But according to the Rambam, to be close to God is a function of one's intellectual knowledge of God. And to that purpose, one should devote his life. Knowledge is the inner soul of Tiferet, according to Kabbalah. And much more, Tiferet is the feeling of being close to God. What more does that mean? If I'm close to God, it means that God is close to me. So the Rambam says that the person who's closer to God, there is more providence on that person. Providence is the eyes of God seeing and guarding you and taking care of you. The eyes of God in Kabbalah refer to the practical eyes of God, looking over a person, taking care, correspond to the next two sfirot, which is called Netzach and Hod. That providence is in pure proportion to one's closeness. So if, according to the Rambam, one's closeness to God is a function of Da'at, which is the inner soul of Tiferet, from that then comes out the providence over the person. And once more, the Rambam does not distinguish between Jew and non-Jew. Hasidus, the Rambam rationalized the Torah to fit with his understanding. Hasidus, in learning the Rambam, also tries to rationalize the Rambam in order to place him into the context of Hasidus. How does it do so in respect to this particular point that we just now made? Hasidus explains that when the Rambam speaks of more providence over one who knows God more and less providence over one who knows God less, that only means revealed providence. How much it's revealed, but in truth, according to the simple faith of understanding of the Baal Shem Tov, there is particular providence over every the smallest phenomenon of reality. It's just a question of how much it is revealed, how much is concealed. And this is the way that Hasidus rationalizes. If we don't learn the Rambam, we don't need this rationalization at all. But if we want to learn the Rambam and make it fit into the understanding of Hasidus, this is the way that we rationalize the Rambam, that he's speaking only of revealed providence. The next is Yesod. One of the meanings of Yesod in Kabbalah and Hasidut is order. We've spoken about this many times. Once more, one of the great criticisms against the Rambam is that even though he writes that the 13th principle of faith is to believe in the resurrection, many great sages in his time and immediately afterwards, and this is in the generations afterwards, said that deep down, I think that you do not believe in resurrection. And for which reason he had to write a whole treatise called Igeret Chiyat HaMeitim in order to justify himself that he does believe in resurrection. But that's one of his 13 principles. How did this problem arise in understanding the Rambam? How could people think that he doesn't believe in resurrection? So the reason is very simple, because he says that the world to come is purely soul without body. Since he makes it very strong, and even it's so strong that if you believe otherwise, you're a fool. Because a body cannot exist forever, and the world to come is forever. A body is finite, and a finite corporal body must die, must perish. Entropy. And the Rambam believes in the law of entropy. A body cannot exist forever. So the world to come is purely spiritual, according to the Rambam. So once more, that angered many, many Jewish great sages, to the extent that this is one of the reasons that it is, after the Rambam, there are many cases of attempts, at least, to excommunicate all of the writings, at least of the philosophical writings of the Rambam. They were even burned, but there were other great Hasidic texts that were burned, other things that were burned in history. So apparently it's a big honor to have your books burned. In any event, the Rambam also had that honor at a certain point. And how does the Rambam explain? The Rambam, his belief, and this is what he explains in the Igerata and Tchiyat HaMetim, says that definitely there will be a physical resurrection of the dead, but it will only be a temporal phenomena, temporal reality. And since the bodies will return, and bodies cannot live forever, they will live for 100 years or for however long, doesn't matter, and they will die. And what will remain will be an eternal spiritual world to come. That is the faith of the Rambam. And once more, this was not accepted by many of his peers. But that's what he believes. Means he believes in resurrection, but he does not believe that that state of resurrection is forever. That what is forever is a purely spiritual reality of the soul, which is non-corporal, because he does not believe in corporality. Okay, even this Hasidus tries to rationalize in a certain way, which we will now not go into. Rationalize means to put it into the system that we believe that the physical world will remain forever. How can we believe that? Because of him, just to say in very, very short, that there will be some transformation of physicality. The corporality itself will undergo a metamorphosis. And that the physical reality will rise to a state that is no longer under the law of entropy. It's just to be said in short. But according to the Ram, once more, the Ram makes it very clear that there are two stages. One is the resurrection, the other is the world to come. Two different things. Tzvei dinim. Different things altogether. Before that is a third different thing, which is called Yemot HaMashiach, the Messianic era, which is just like our time, according to the Rambam. Before that is called Olam Hazeh, and before that is called Tohu. So again, I'm now saying very interesting. What Yesod is putting historical stages into order. So in Yesod, we're now explaining that according to the Rambam, if you want to put the whole history of creation into order, there are actually 5 stages, 2 given stages and 3 stages to come. According to the Arizal, every human soul is created with 2 spiritual levels, called the Nefesh and the Ruach. But then there are 3 yet to come, which are called the Neshama and the Chaya and the Yechidah. The same is according to the spiritual history and order of reality. The 2 given stages are called what preceded our physical order, which is Tohu. And then our present physical order, which is Olam Hazeh. And then the days of Mashiach, the purpose of which, according to the Rambam, as he explained at the end of the code, is simply knowledge, the ability to have everything at the tip of your fingers to be able to know God, which is the neshama, nishmat shakai tevinem. to know and understand, to contemplate God. That's the Yemot HaMashiach. Then comes the Chaya. What is the Chaya, the level of Chaya? As the word says, Chaya is Techiyah, is resurrection. Techiyat HaMeitim. But then the fifth level, the Yechidah, that's the eternal world to come, which is non-corporal, according to the Rambam. Acharon Chaviv, the last concept of the Rambam is Malchut. Simply Malchut can mean government. The Rambam says that all the laws of the Torah are just to make it able for the Jew better to know God. That actually they're just two commandments. I'm saying also in very short. According to the Rambam, there are only two commandments. The first and the second commandments of the Ten Commandments. To believe in God and not to worship idolatry. That's the whole Torah. Actually, this very statement is said in Tanya. That all of the commandments are contained in these two. Because all of the positive commandments are to believe in God, and all of the negative commandments are not to worship idolatry. And this is actually this is the premise of the Rambam. The whole idea of government and society, and actually all of the laws of the Torah, the Rambam makes it very clear, is all simply a support system for the community and the individual to be able to best perform, be mekayim in Hebrew, these two commandments. To come to perfect faith in God and not to worship idolatry. Idolatry is anthropomorphism. Idolatry is identifying God with any physicality. That's for the Rambam, idolatry. And that's just at this simple level. What are the commandments all about? What are they for? And why do we have to invest so much time and energy into creating a social reality which abides by the laws of the Torah? But there's something more about Malchut. Malchut is the question of the creation of the world. Unlike other philosophers, the Rambam does not connect the creation of the world, the question of was the world created ex nihilo or not, does not make it dependent upon faith in God at all. But faith in God, all of the precepts of faith in God, that God exists, that God is one, that God is non-corporal, that God is eternal, that we must pray. The first 5 of the 13 principles of faith, which all apply to God, have no mention whatsoever and nothing to do with the question of whether the world was created by God or not. The concept of creation is a different category altogether. Unlike the kalam, which are in the time of the Rambam, the philosophy of the Islamic philosophy, which many of the great Islamic sages of his time and afterwards said, this is just an example to understand what is these two Rambams, the Rambam of the Code and the Rambam of the Guide, would say that if I would just read the Guide, I would think that the author of this book is an Islamic philosopher. That's what they said when studying the Guide. But nonetheless, he takes part with the style. He relies upon the second master, Al-Fabri. The second master after Aristotle is an Islamic sage, or the Rambam. But he parts with many of the philosophers, and he, in a very, very simple precept of creation, according to that theory, and this actually is stated explicitly in Chassidut, as they said, as the Rambam denies. They say that first, it's provable, or it's self-understood, that the world must be mechudash, must be created, something from nothing. And if it's created, it must be a created reality. Reality is, this table cannot come from primordial matter. No such thing. Impossible. If, as soon as I understand that this table and everything, this whole world, this whole universe, must be created, then I can take the next step and say that if it's created, there must be a creator. The first thing about creation is that the Rambam denies that train of thought. The Rambam says there's no way, it's non-obvious. You think that it's obvious that the world must have been created. It could not have existed forever. I say that's not obvious at all. Aristotle said it's not only it's not obvious, he thought the very opposite. The world is primordial. What's the phrase? There's a phrase that the greatest mind in Hasidic thought is called Rabbi Isaac of Holman. Talking about intellect, about pure intellect. One of the things that he explains throughout, and this is other Hasidic texts, is En davar oseh et atzmo. Nothing makes itself. This table did not make itself. Just like this table did not make itself, the universe did not make itself. That's, unless I misunderstand, that's the thought process of the Kalam, which the Rambam denies. That's the first thing that he denies. Afterwards, he distinguishes that there are three possible explanations for creation. One is the explanation of Moses. That's what he says. Yeah, Moses, the first Moses. Moses, Plato, and Aristotle. And he explains them exactly according to Kabbalah in the way of Bria Yetzirah Asiyah. That Moses holds that the world was created de novo ex nihilo. It was created as something new from nothing. New from nothing. Plato says the world was created de novo, new from something. And Aristotle says that the world is primordial, that it's neither new, and certainly it's not from nothing. These three levels are exact, simple explanations of the three lower worlds. Because Bria, as the Rambam explains, the Ramban, Maimonides, the word Bria means something from nothing. So it's both new and ex nihilo. But Yetzirah, the next world, is new. The appearance is on the surface it's totally new, but it comes from some primordial matter called Yesh Miyesh. But Af Asitiv, the lower world, is just it's not a new form altogether. It's a retake. It's a continuous retake of, we call it now recycling. The lower world of Asiya is a continuous recycling of primordial matter. So the Rambam says that this is the belief of Moses, the belief of Plato, and the belief of Aristotle. And he says that I can't prove either of these three. I just believe more in Moses, and he says that Moses makes a little bit more sense. Aristotle is against the Torah, so I must depart from him, even though he's my favorite in general. But in this particular case, I must abandon him, because if he could prove it, I would have to accept it. But he can't prove it, and it contradicts the Torah, so I must leave him out. And Plato, he says, b'di'eved means de facto, you're not a heretic if you believe in Plato, in his level. But the most sense is to believe in Moses. Okay, this all is the question of creation. Yes, creation, no creation. 3 levels. Bria, Yitzira, Asiyah, Moses, Plato, and Aristotle. But creation of this physical realm, of this universe that we're in, is also a question of Malchut. According to Kabbalah, the world was created from Malchut of Ein Sof. And from Malchut of the world of Atzilut comes out these 3 worlds, the 3 conceptions of creation. So that's where we're placing here also. And let's now conclude this whole, after we went through now all of the 10 Sfirot, conclude with the thought that we mentioned before. Who is the true Rambam? Again, for scholars, there are at least 2. Actually, we could even identify 3 Rambams. Because just like we have the Rambam, the legal authority, the codifier of Jewish law, on the one side, we have the Rambam, the philosopher, the Aristotle philosopher on the other hand. In the middle, we have a third Rambam, which is Rambam, the physician. After his brother drowned and he was left without parnoso, without livelihood, he had to devote himself to study medicine, and he became perhaps the greatest physician of his time, and he became the physician of the Sultan of Egypt, and he worked so hard in this field of medicine that virtually, even though he himself says, he swears, he makes an oath in the code that whoever lives, he outlines a good lifestyle. And he says that whoever lives by this lifestyle, I swear to him that he will live a long and healthy life and never be sick. He himself, so I'd expect, if this is what he wrote, that he should have lived 120 years, 180 years. The Rambam himself, because he knows the secret of how to live. Today is his yahrzeit. Usually it was thought that the Rambam lived a little bit less than 70 years. But most of the modern scholars actually place his birthday 3 years later, meaning that he lived 66 years. It's a machloket as to when he was born, in which year he was born. The date of the birth is known because he himself writes. He was born on the 14th of Nisan in the afternoon, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 14th of Nisan, before the Seder. The very last thing that he composed in his lifetime was a treatise against astrology. As we know that he was super against astrology. That was actually the last thing that he wrote. But he made a big point of the hour that he was born. So, and then he went, why didn't he live so long? He knew the secret of good health. the greatest physician in the world. So he himself actually foresees it and foretells it. He literally worked himself to death. He worked so hard in the court of the Sultan, and then afterwards, when he came home, he said he had hundreds of people every day that he had to treat, both Jews and non-Jews. Just waiting in line, he treated them for free. He writes how exhausted he is. He literally worked himself to death. The RAMBAM. This is also part of his contradiction, because he says, would it be up to me, he writes, I would have lived in solitude, in total seclusion, and devoted myself only to knowing God, because this is what I believe, that the purpose of man on earth is to know God. And instead, in practice, in reality, I devoted my whole life to helping people, to healing people. That's a contradiction. What is life for? What are you supposed to accomplish in life? So actually there are 3 RAMBAMs. Much more. In healing people also, there was no distinction. The modern medical books say that the RAMBAM is actually the first physician to be totally non-gizani, non-racial. No distinction whatsoever between a Jewish patient and a non-Jewish patient. And no talking, they make a point of no telling the patient what to believe in. Just pure practice of medicine to heal other people. So we have Rambam, the Jewish law, the authority on Jewish law. We have Rambam, the physician. We have Rambam, the philosopher. 3 different Rambams. It's Chashmal Mal, the secret of these 3 Rambams. Who is the true Rambam? So again, in the university, they only speak of 2 Rambams, and they say everyone is it's almost a joke that it says that if you're in the secular world of the university, so it's clear for you that the true Rambam is the guide, the Rambam is the guide, and the Rambam that wrote the code of Jewish law, that's just for the simple believing Jews. But if you're a rabbi, so chas v'shalom, that's heresy to say such a thing. The true Rambam is the Rambam of the code. That's the real Rambam. And we see that is actually the Hashkocha Pratis has it, that's the Rambam that has remained the most. Even though scholars still study the guide, but in yeshivas, nobody studies the guide, only the code of the Rambam. And the depth of that code is so deep. How simple it is, it's so deep that there is unending chidushim, innovation in understanding the depth of the thought of the Rambam in the code. So once more, for the rabbi, the Rambam is the code, and the fact that he wrote this guide, that's just has to be explained away in a certain way, that he had also he wrote it for even explicitly, he wrote it for one student, maybe for another one. He wrote it for some people that were perplexed. All of the modern scholars say that the Rambam considered himself to be one of the perplexed. It's just like they say that the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe, wrote it for himself. All great books, the author writes for himself. And so if he wrote a guide for the perplexed, it means that he himself was one of those perplexed. So again, the question: so who is the real Rambam? Please stand up. It says lo kam k'Moshe, which means that he didn't stand. Maybe he never wanted him to stand up. Who is the real Rambam? The code Rambam or the guide Rambam? Seems to be a contradiction. So maybe the physician in the middle can unite the two. Certainly there's one Rambam. There's another important thing about the Rambam that he himself says that the question is, this for scholars is maybe the most important things now in studying the Rambam. Should you believe that this is especially with regard to the guide or with other in general, should we believe that to take on surface everything that the Rambam writes, that what he writes he believes in? Sounds totally off the wall. Does the Rambam really believe what he writes, or does he have some underlying secret opinion? Many that learn the guide, after all of the trying to negate the opinion of Aristotle as to the primordiality of the creation of the world, that the world is primordial, the universe. So they say that at the end, these are secular scholars. They say the more that he defends Moses, they feel that means the more that secretly he believes in Aristotle. This has been a controversy amongst the scholars for the last 100 years. In any event, the Rambam himself says that when you're teaching a new student, you have to teach him things which later on you will explain to him when he progresses and matures in his understanding, that those things that I taught you in grade 1 were only for grade 1 students. But now, when you've reached the university, I'm teaching you things which actually contradict what I taught you in grade 1. Now, this is okay, because in general, sometimes you have to give, for instance, give a person, a child, a candy, and then afterwards he does it lishma. He learns it for its own sake. But he says more than that. Actually, he says at one point that there are 7 forms of contradiction in writing and teaching. One of which is that first you say something that afterwards you're going to say the opposite. And second is, he says, I'm only going to talk about 2 of the 7. And the second is that sometimes a person teaches and expounds upon a certain topic based upon a premise. And the next class, he expounds again on that topic based upon another premise which contradicts the original premise. But the student doesn't know that. The teacher knows that, and the student does not know that the first premise that the whole first lecture was based on, and the second premise that the second lecture was based on, contradict one another. A few classes ago, I think that we mentioned in short, just by a point, that from contradiction comes innovation. Even according to one theory of creation comes is generated by contradiction. So this is something very, very, very deep that is expressed in the writings of the Rambam himself. We're not saying two extremely opposite. The Rambam is usually understood to be the most rational thinker of all times. The most rational thinker, the most logical thinker, the one that negates astrology and anything which is non-scientific, which is non-rational, he negates, he fights against. But there's something underlying in the thought of the Rambam, and the contradiction is mystical. Why is contradiction mystical? Because contradiction is called Nesiyat HaPachim, it's the ability to bear opposites. Only God bears opposites, and in Him the opposites are not opposites at all. This is the foundation of Chassidut, actually. So once more, who is the true Rambam? And this whole concept of contradiction. And now we're all giving it its source in the Torah, Moshe lo psik tama b'gavayo. We're saying here we have two Rambams. Before we said that Moshe is the first Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, and our Moses, the Rambam. Now we're saying in a different way that Moshe is you. Moshe, there are two of you. It's like the once more quantum experiment. There are two Moseses coming up from the same slot. Moshe, lo psik tama b'gavayo. There's our code Moses and our guide Moses, and maybe another third Moses, all the Rambam. So he is foretelling us of quantum reality and quantum physics and messianic knowledge of God. So with this we'll conclude.
Okay, whoever the real Rambam is,
please stand up.
We hope he got lots of nachas from this shiur. Anyone who came to this shiur with a clear mind, I'm sure you're more perplexed now. And if anyone came perplexed, hopefully you're more clear about things. About the Rambam, I don't know. But from the Rambam till today, I don't know if he ever had it so good. And actually, I have to say, the last thing he said, that Moshe, so we see he had 3 40-year periods of his life, and each one was very, very different. And in fact, I learned this from you, that when he killed the Mitzri, so the gematria of Hamitzri equals Moshe. So Moshe really did have 3 different stages in his life, each one very, very different. And yet he was the same Moshe. So that is somehow bridging the contradictions in his own life. Okay, a few announcements just in case people leave or can't watch anymore. The next shiur is Sunday, February 4th, the 19th of Shvat. And I'm going to mention again a very important notice that Rabbi Ginsburgh will be making, God willing, his first lecture tour in America in many, many years. And Gali Nai is looking for people who will not only step up and help bring Rabbi Ginsburgh to their city, their Beit Knesset or whatever, but also who can help with the financial realities of making such a tour possible. So please write to Gal Einai either on WhatsApp or on the email for this class, and please step forward to making this lecture tour not only possible, but if it's successful, hopefully it will pave the way for many more in the future. Okay, so now we'll start with our questions. We're going to start with questions from the Kahal here. Anyone has a question? I don't see any hands. Well, I already said I don't see any hands, so yours will be next. So I think two obvious questions that I was kind of waiting for you to address was, especially in Keter and faith, is maybe just some insight to the 13 principles of faith that maybe the Rambam is most known. It's in every siddur, and it's so much associated with the Rambam. If you want to tell us a little bit, maybe why he felt necessary to do this, what's the background. And the second question is also a very obvious question, is according to Rambam, his whole belief about attributes of Hashem. So I know that you explained, but it definitely needs to be explained, the 13 midot of Rachamim, because that's probably the most explicit in the Torah, and it's revealed by God himself, about himself, as it were. So if you could address those two questions.
Okay, according to the Rebbe of Kamarno, there's a long treatise that he writes to see the correspondence between the 13 principles of faith that the Rambam outlines and the 13 attributes of mercy. So it's very worthwhile to learn that. The reason that we didn't actually talk about, when I first thought about talking about the Rambam today, I thought maybe we would devote the whole thing to the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam, which may be the most famous thing. But since we've had many classes on that in the past, I thought that it would be better to do something new, just like the world was created anew. But the 13 principles for us is like primordial matter, but we believe in chidush olam, so we have to do something new. We said that something new comes out of contradiction, so we have to have some contradiction, and then something new will happen. But once more, we've had many classes on the 13 principles, and the chidush is what we now said, that the Kamarno Rebbe does see a direct correspondence between the 13 principles and the 13 attributes of mercy, and the 13 attributes of mercy in Kabbalah correspond to the 13 tikkunei dikna, the sections of the divisions of the symbolic beard of Ari Hanpin. The reason that one thought we had that we didn't express explicitly, we talked about anger in Keter. Why so? Because, and anger does not exist in God. The name for Keter is Ari Hanpin, which means that he never gets angry. Ze'er Hanpin is the possibility, the lower, the small, what's called the small countenance, is the appearance of anger. But Ari Hanpin, which is the Keter, really means that he himself is never angry. So that's exactly the thought that we made before, and that's where the 13 principles come from. And obviously the 13 principles of mercy is definitely, as you said, is the most important place in the Torah that we have attributes of God. That God has given attributes, and they're all mercy. And all of them has to be understood in the way of Dat, of the Rambam, in the manner of negation. And that's what we addressed at some length right now.
Most of the people in the world, suffering before sin, there's no death before sin. And now we into the Siddha, what we know from the Siddur, the question is, the one God Adam is also indeed towards mankind. And then we have in the time that Moses can states, Yod, Barat Hashem, Barat Tzadikim, how does all is all that into the time together?
I have to admit I lost my train of thought, so I'm going to ask the Rav to repeat the question.
No, you repeat it again.
Can you repeat it like slowly and more simply?
I want to understand the better result. Please, about what the Rav said that most of the evil that is coming from is coming from the human being himself. So this is related to what we have in the Sefer Shabbat. There's no suffering. There's no suffering without sin, and there's no death without sin. Then there's a very basic example before the Chassidut that Shem is why God and Adam is also indeed towards mankind. And then we have the Tanya that the Lord can states Yod, who says Barat Hashem, Barat Tzadikim. So how is all of that intertwined together to create that conception that evil is coming from the Maimonides? Was the also the power of Hashem deciding that if he is also indeed towards mankind?
Okay, just to simplify that, it's a very deep question, but the question is asking the Rav to clarify in more detail or better this idea of evil coming, a little bit of evil coming from nature, a little bit of evil coming from other people or circumstances, but the vast majority of evil is coming from the person himself in light of different statements in Masechet Shabbat and the Tanya and Iyov.
The Ram says that all these levels exist, and every quote is referring to one of these levels. But he just says that the majority is coming from oneself, that's all. Every quotation is true, and it's a question of proportion. No, it says that the no ra comes from Imala, Milamala. That's working through man himself. That maybe man and God gives. The RAMBAM explains, when talking about astrology and other things, that man is born with the inclination to different, to either good or evil, but he can overcome it with true choice. That's the whole idea of free choice. Even when it says Norah, the quote that he quoted now is that sometimes it said that as though that God Himself is almost seducing the person to do something wrong, whether it's Adam or whether it's King David. According to the Rambam, in any case whatsoever, there is never Norah Lila B'nei Adam which overrides the power of free choice. That's all. That's very strong and definite in the thought of the Rambam. The person has free choice, and if he does not use that free choice positively, even though he's being pushed by providence in a certain direction, if he succumbs to that push and doesn't use his free choice to overcome that, he's responsible. No? Oh, so that's not like the Rambam.
So he doesn't believe that people comes from
no. Once more, we're not, right now we won't talk about somebody else, but just talking about that. According to the Rambam, he was very tremendously adamant about the power of free choice. And therefore he says that anything that a person does bad to himself, even though there are reasons for it, psychological reasons, social reasons for it, divine reasons for it. But he could have overcome that by using his free choice to the maximum.
In our daily life, to reach RAMBAM, we need to act the same the Muslims, to the physician, to the law, or to the philosopher.
Okay, the question is, of the 3 Rambams that the Rav presented to us, which one should we emulate in our day? Which one should be the example that we should be most influenced by or follow?
All right, so we said that the 3 we put together according to this formula, which is called Chash Malmal. Chash is submission, Hachna Avdalam Taka, and the terminology of the Baal Shem Tov. The first Rambam it's even chronologically the case. The first Rambam is the Rambam of the Code, and that is our submission to receive the yoke of heaven, of the kingdom of heaven, and to be a good Jew that does that performs the will of God through the means of His commandments. That's the first Rambam, and that's the first Rambam in ourselves. The second Rambam, we'll call him the physician, the person that cuts himself off of what he would like to do in order to help other people, in order to devote himself to other people. So we'll call that Havdalah. Circumcising himself, that's Mal, is self-circumcision. And the third Rambam is to doing what he really likes to do, and then with this we agree with the university people. And with himself, actually, because he says himself that what he really was into was philosophy. That was his real love, because that's, as he says, that he wanted to come close to God. And that's the way he felt that he was coming close to God. For him, that is the hamtaka, that's the sweetening. So we also try to emulate all these 3 stages of the chashmamal in the Rambam, and to make it one unity. There's another, the way that in the academy they say that there's the conservative Rambam and there's the liberal Rambam. Or there's before we were talking in previous classes, we were talking about militant people, different people, not the same person. That some are militant, some are pacifists. So here in our Moshe, just like you said before about the first thing that Moshe did, he killed the Egyptian. So we have the militant Moshe and we have the pacifist Moshe, in the case of the Rambam. There's total dichotomy of character traits, of personality. But the most important now in modern times is the conservative, like the right Rambam, the conservative, and the liberal Rambam. You could call them, it's obviously not true to call them the religious and the secular, but it is true to call him conservative and liberal. That he has this very, very conservative side to him, and he has this very, very liberal side to him. And it's the same person. That's the greatness. And the whole thing was to come to what we feel to be the real greatness of the Rambam. That the absolute greatness is the very fact that he's super conservative and in a way is super liberal.
Okay, because the class went a little bit longer than usual tonight, we're going to minimize the questions. We're going to take one from cyberspace, at least one, and we have one from here. Oh, so this is from Melbourne, Australia. An excellent question. The Rav said there absolutely is no anger in God or associated with God. And the question is, so how do we understand the Gemara that talks about that Bilam knew the split second every day when God would get angry? And through that, he would be able to, chas v'shalom, curse the Jew. So how do we understand that anger?
Okay, so that anger is something which God placed in nature. that something which is the way that God runs the world, not God himself, it's something created. That he placed in we see it very explicitly, this is the truth, that every day there's something in nature that there's a second. There's a whole sugya in the Gemara and Avodah Zarah in the beginning that explains how physically to even experience the phenomenon of that second, what happens. That you take a chicken, and I don't want to say the whole story, but there's a whole way to see when that second takes place. I mean, that is all part of nature. It's part of the laws of nature.
So based on what you said in the book, Five Dynamics of Leadership That Could Change the World, so you said that when Mashiach comes, nature will be tamed. That maybe what you're saying is that the anger principle engraved in nature will undergo a fundamental change, and it will no longer, as it were, be angry. Is that correct?
I'm all for that.
Okay, we're all for it. No more earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, volcanoes, deep freezes that many of you who are listening in Chutz La'aretz are probably huddling in your house because you don't dare to go outside. Okay, one more question.
In last month's shiur, we talked about structure. The structure of the Torah having three phases.
Yes.
In this month's shiur, the Rav was talking about three phases of RAMBAM. Is a connection there?
The connection is if we place them in order as we just... Did everybody hear the question?
The question is that last shiur, the Rav spoke about Seder and mentioned that there is a Seder in the Torah as well, a 3-part Seder, which maybe the Rav will review for us. And how does this connect to the 3 Rambams that we learned about tonight?
Okay, so historically, as we said, that there is a Seder also in the 3 stages of the Rambam. What came first, the guide or the physician? It could be that in his lifetime, actually, his physician was the end of the later part of his life. But he studied medicine many, many years. It says that he studied medicine for over 20 years. He studied all of the classical medicine that existed before him. Also which he received much from the great physicians of previous times, but he innovated many, many things. He innovated himself from his own experience in medicine. And we put them into a logical order by saying that it's Chashmal Mal, or Achna Avdalam Taka. That first he's an obedient servant of God and of the Torah. Then he's devoted to helping mankind. We could have said it in the opposite order also. We could have said that then he secludes himself and just contemplates God to know God. That's the circumcision or the Havdalah. And then he comes into the world and he ends his life by devoting himself to mankind, to healing the ills of mankind. So actually we could have reversed the two last stages of the Chashmal Mal. But definitely it's an order. In any event, it's an order of 3 stages.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next month.